Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Maria Ceballos Wallace, and I'm going to be one of your instructors today. We're going to talk a little bit about remote interpreting technologies. Now, I hope that doesn't make you nervous because, unfortunately, with this new COVID 19 reality, we all have to deal with remote technologies, telecommuting, working from home. And fortunately, interpreters can actually do some of their work from remote locations. We're going to cover the three main types of remote interpretation technologies and systems that might come up once you become certified. So let's get started. So let's start with key terminology. Remote interpreting technologies, RIT, are actually different types of technologies which can be used to make it possible for interpretation to happen in more than one place at a time. That means that the person needing services doesn't have to be next to the interpreter and vice versa. Now, it takes on many modalities, which include over the phone interpretation, which is really kind of self explanatory over the phone, but it does have some nuances. Video remote interpreting, which uses teleconferencing services to provide interpreting services, and remote simultaneous interpreting, which is one of the most exciting developments of remote interpreting technologies in the last couple of years. This presentation is going to seem a little bit text heavy for you, but it's intended so that you can later reflect on what is included in this PowerPoint and compare and contrast the different types of remote interpretation platforms and technologies. Basically, how we're going to proceed is that I'm going to talk to you about the similarities and differences of the OPI, which is over the phone interpretation, VRI, video remote interpretation, and RSI, remote simultaneous interpretations. We're going to discuss what they are, what they're used for, when they're used for, what do you need, and how you can get in on some of that action as well. So over the phone interpretation basically either can be as simple as using one telephone to connect to two other people who are connected on a line and interpreting, and that would require that you interpret consecutively because only one party can speak at a time. Or it could also be possible that you might be in a call center and their calls could be coming in from insurance companies, or calls could be coming in from the jail or somewhere else and somebody needs interpretation, and you are sitting on you're on your phone and you're in your office and you're using a headset similar to this, and you basically interpret for that person. Now, video remote interpretation is a little bit more like what we're doing right now in terms of the online course. There will be a camera and there will be several people who are present via camera, and the interpreter will be able to see that person. Generally, standard VRI is conducted in the consecutive mode because only one person is allowed to speak at any one time to make sure that everybody can understand each other and that the record is clear. But remote simultaneous interpretation, or RSI, is the process where technology has been adapted and includes video so that it is possible for additional channels to be added to the platform, and an interpreter can actually do a simultaneous interpretation in real time from another location for somebody who is actually just listening to what is saying without having to participate. This is used more often for conferences and big meetings, but it can also be used for court. Now, how does it work? Well, we will always have at least two speakers and one interpreter. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. For OPI and for VRI, we are going to always have at least two speakers and one interpreter. The interpreter can be located in a completely different location than the speakers. They can be located in the same location, and an attorney or a doctor or another person can be located. So the variations are infinite, to tell you the truth. But the bottom line is that the voices are transmitted through a telephone or some kind of a digital setting. What do the interpreters do? The interpreters hear the speaker on their headset microphone. They wait for the full utterance. They take notes perhaps. Then they render their translated utterance orally into the target language, and only one person speaks at a time. This is the OPI platform. This is real time. It's only one audio track, and everybody takes these terms. The audience, in turn, has to do what everybody else is doing. Okay? Now, VRI, OPI, and RSI can be used in many types of settings. In particular, for our interest, we want to look at court hearings and proceedings, jails, mediations, police encounters, attorney-client meetings, probation, and others. But it can also be used in medical encounters, community encounters, educational situations, government situations, business, customer service encounters, and actually customer service counters as such, where people approach perhaps even a courthouse and they ask for information on how to go somewhere, how to process a certain document. And if a person is not available who speaks their language pair, then a phone interpreter might be called or a video interpreter might be called, and that whole conversation can happen through remote interpreting. Conference as well are included, and trainings. Remote interpreting technologies presents a host of advantages, not just for interpreters, but also for limited English proficients and for parties that need to make sure that that gap between the limited English proficient and the court system is bridged. Interpreters can be available off-site, which means that there you can have additional languages of lesser diffusion available at shorter intervals. You can also save on travel. There's economies of scales, and you can have those interpreters on demand or on standby in case you need them. It can help you avoid or resolve conflicts of interest if you only have one or two interpreters of one language pair in one region, and those interpreters are unable to continue with a case or are unable to provide additional services. We can accommodate inclement weather. Let's say you are in the north where it's snowing and you need to talk to somebody needs to talk to somebody in the jail, or somebody needs an interpreter for an arraignment and they can't get their local interpreters. You might be able to make a phone call or a video remote conference request and get an interpreter in another state or in another location. So basically the advantages include off-site, on-call, on demand. The disadvantages, though, are some of the same advantages. Fancy that. That when you're offsite, you encounter possibilities where you might have technical difficulties, sound difficulties, visual difficulties. Interpreters, especially interpreters who are sign language interpreters, must control the visual environment very, very, very carefully, because being out of frame, in frame, or any kind of loss of bandwidth that affects the visual communication may actually impact the communication between all of the parties. Often, because there is such a low bar to access a telephone or maybe a computer, often people think that interpreting is just as easy in person as it is on the phone or on the computer. But in fact, it's actually more difficult, it is more tiring, it requires much more multitasking than in person interpreting. It's also harder to maintain control of the parties and the flow. People who perhaps are not used to working with interpreters might get very excited and want to speak before the interpreter has finished his or her rendition into whichever language they're interpreting to or from. It provides an additional cognitive load for interpreters because we're no longer able to focus on what is happening in our immediate environment, but we have all these little screens in front of us, which have all these different parties that may not even be speaking, but they may be moving. There may be some additional distractions. There may be some distracting background. And even for oral interpreters, spoken language interpreters, there's still going to be limited visual and physical cues. Right now, you can only see me up to about perhaps the bottom of my shoulders. But generally, it helps to get a general sense of the person's demeanor, how at ease they are, or if they are not comfortable with how they're holding their body. So, those physical and those visual cues are really important for interpreters to understand what's going on. Nevertheless, you can still succeed at remote interpreting, and we're going to be seeing a lot more use for remote interpreters. The keys to success are the followings. You have to ask the right questions in advance before you take any kind of interpreting assignment. Who are you going to interpret for? Where are they going to be? Is there going to be one person or more people who are is going to be in one location while you're in a separate location? Will my technical setup be compatible with a court's technical setup? Will it be possible for me to have available resources in advance? Documents, information, documents that will be referred to, for example, if a person is taking a plea on, let's say, a misdemeanor, does the interpreter need to do a site translation of a plea agreement or of an accusation or the list of charges? Are the parties informed of how to use an interpreter? If they're not informed on how to use an interpreter, may we have a moment to address how to work with an interpreter so that we can do this expeditiously and accurately? So, the key to success, in addition to information, when you are providing remote interpreting services, is to have very good collaboration with the judge, the court personnel, the lawyer, the LEP parties. Everybody has to be on the same team in terms of making sure that all the information that is needed, all the documents that are needed, and that everybody is willing to wait their turn so that the interpreter can do their job. You've probably wondered whether remote interpreter can be used in any circumstance for court interpreting. And the answer is no, not really. There are some very, very specific guidelines we should follow when we are doing remote interpreting. More than anything, remote interpreting, whether it's OPI or VRI, should be limited to short, non evidentiary hearings that typically last 30 minutes or less. We talked a little bit earlier about the multitasking aspect of remote interpreting and the possibility of cognitive load and therefore impairment or fatigue for the interpreter. So we must be very certain that we are not overloading the interpreter. Usually, it's suitable when there's no on site staff or qualified freelance interpreter, and there is a time sensitive matter to be heard. These are generally things like arraignments or bond hearings, bond reconsideration hearings. Also, it's suitable when there's no available on site staff or qualified freelance interpreter for a less immediate matter. What I mean by that is perhaps something that is a simple matter, a return of a bond by a judge, somebody who's coming to get their bond returned and they just need to present some documents. There could be many other simple situations where somebody is requesting a new date. That, for example, could be something that's simply done through an OPI or a VRI interpreter. And when it is more responsible to obtain the service remotely than to delay a court proceeding. So this is up to the discretion of the judge. When a judge determines that it is a matter which should be handled immediately, whether it has to do with safety of family or a temporary protection order, or whether it has to do with a bond or any other type of situation that might be time sensitive, this would be up to the judge to decide. Additional considerations for remote interpreting include whether or not there is testimony or cross examination as part of the proceeding. If there is testimony and if there is cross examination and it is a complex proceeding, then it's going to take far longer. And all of the cues that I mentioned earlier, perhaps audio quality, video quality, may interfere with the interpreter's ability to provide the best possible interpretation. It is suitable for uncontested infractions that require no testimony, such as a speeding ticket or something along those lines. For immediate events that can't be delayed, we talked about this earlier: arraignments, custody defendants, bail reductions, temporary restraining orders. And if the LEP party is present in the courtroom and it would be too difficult for that person to come back. Now, it's also very interesting that an additional consideration for ASL or LEPs includes when that person speaks a standard, well recognized language that does not require two interpreters for relay interpretation. So, for example, if you have a person who speaks Spanish and English or French and German, those languages generally you can find an interpreter who can interpret from one to the other. But if, for example, you only have a Swahili interpreter who speaks French but not English, and you'd have to interpret from English to French, then to Swahili, then that would be an unacceptable way of conducting the interpretation through remote interpretation. Now, non-appropriate events for remote interpretation pretty much correlate with what we talked about earlier. Events when a court certified interpreter is available and on site, usually on site in person is your default, where how you want to do that. Events that are long and complex. And generally, with a long and complex event, you're probably going to want to deal with a team of interpreters or several interpreters to take turns to mitigate interpreter fatigue. As we said earlier, and we cannot stress this enough in events that include testimony. Testimony is such an important part of court proceedings, and the nuances which are presented in testimony can sometimes be lost if it is taken out of the environment of an in person proceeding. And to reiterate, it is not appropriate for events where relay interpreting is necessary to accommodate either a language of lesser diffusion or, for example, an American Sign Language interpreter with a CDI and a deaf party. So now that we've gone over some of the appropriate proceedings where you might use remote interpreting, let's talk about how to prepare for that. First, there's the technical preparation, and that involves everything that has to do with your equipment and your connection. It includes your headset, your microphone, perhaps if you're using a laptop, your webcam. You have to make sure that you have all of the proper equipment that is functioning, and you might even want to make sure that you have additional equipment just in case one of your pieces of equipment stops functioning and you need to replace one in the middle of an interpretation. One of the critical aspects of this kind of interpretation is that you are only as good as your internet connection or your audio connection is. So if you're doing phone interpreting, generally VoIP or landlines are recommended. And if you are doing video remote interpreting or RSI, then you definitely need to be hardwired into your internet and you need to have a high speed connection. Once you have prepared yourself technically, you have everything you need, then you have to set yourself up. One of the most important things is that if you're going to be working with a court system, you have to familiarize yourself with their system. What do they use? Do they use Zoom? Do they use their own proprietary system? Will they be sending you documents via email or will they send them to you via a secure server? Are you familiar with whether or not they allow or they want you to interpret consecutively or simultaneously? What is your plan for your backup redundancy in case there's a faulty connection? And is your environment in your place of work, whether it's your home office, is it suitable to protect the privacy of the parties that you're interpreting for. So you have to have a suitable space, avoid kitchens, avoid distractions, pets, interruptions. If you have to put a sign outside your front door to make sure that nobody knocks or rings a doorbell during the times that you're working, then go ahead and do that. Be careful with extraneous noise. For example, let's say clocks that ring at every hour. Check your lighting, make sure that your lighting is suitable, that you're not facing a window and that you're just going to be completely washed out. Find out whether or not a team will be necessary, because the proceeding may go longer than than they originally intended, or it may be more complicated. And conduct a pre-session, which is a conversation with the parties, meaning the parties that have hired you to do the work, to make sure that you have all the information that you need. Now, once you begin interpreting, or once you are, as they say, online, now you have to introduce yourself, introduce your qualifications. And I always like to make sure that I indicate that I am appearing via telephone interpretation, via remote interpretation, or I sometimes even say the name of the platform that I'm interpreting through. It is so critical that you remember that you must follow all of the same guidelines and rules which you learned through your interpreting codes of ethics. Just because you're interpreting over the phone or through video does not mean that you can add, you can delete, you can omit, you can summarize, you can paraphrase. You have to behave exactly the same way as you would if you were in a court of law. And that's why it's important that in this particular case, you ensure the client's privacy, so that you are working in an environment where other people can't just idly walk by and listen to what you're interpreting, because that really is against the ethics. You need to make sure that you are in a place where it is possible for you to do your job without breaching any of the protocols of your code of ethics. It's also helpful for you to become familiar with different kinds of ways of working. In other words, the configuration of the parties. Perhaps an attorney might be in the courtroom with the party needing the interpreter, and you will be at your home or home office or remote interpreting site. Perhaps the attorney might be at his or her office, and the other person might be on their cell phone through a smartphone, and you might be. So there will be three different locations. So just learn to identify those and figure out how the platform works, so that you are constantly receiving the most information that you possibly can, such as, for example, using what they call the speaker mode on Zoom, which is the camera will it'll present the camera of the person who's speaking at that particular time. That is critical, because if you're watching 5 or 6 cameras at one particular time and only one of them is talking, and because you have 5 or 6 cameras, they are a third the size they could be, you might be missing some vital, critical, physical information. So sign up 15 minutes before the event, or be ready 15 minutes before the event. Often the court personnel doesn't actually start the event until it's time, but if you are there and they sign up early, then it's an opportunity for you to ask questions, test your setup, review your backup plan, and also discuss whether you are going, if you need to intervene, how you're going to intervene. Are you going to raise your hand? Are you going to request a timeout? Are you going to tell them that you can't hear very well because the audio, perhaps the sound? Are you going to ask them to slow down, perhaps? Or are you going to intervene orally? Your Honor, the interpreter is unable to hear the parties. That's an example of an intervention. How are you going to get your documents? Well, basically, once you start interpreting, you will wait, you will do as requested, and the judge will inform you of when you're ready to be excused. After you're excused, make a note. Were there any technical problems on your end? Were there any technical problems on the client's end? Did you need to intervene? If so, why? Because people were talking on top of each other? Was it because there was a problem with the bandwidth? Was it because your dog started barking and you had to ask the parties to hold a moment so that you could calm your dog down and then come back to work? So what could you do? What can you and what can you do differently in the next for your next situation? It's very important that you're always reviewing and that you share this information with the party that hired you. They will understand that you are being proactive, that you are being professional, that you care about the quality of the work that you are producing, and they will take that into consideration when calling you again. Now that you're familiar with the stages of remote interpretation, let's recap the different systems you might be able to use. Over the phone interpreting, video remote interpreting, and remote simultaneous interpretation. Now, OPI and VRI are going to generally use consecutive mode of interpretation. You're going to be interpreting for one person, it's going to be include at least two parties, and you may be doing this directly for the court, for an agency, for a call center, for an attorney. The remote simultaneous interpretation is generally used more for conference interpreting. However, there's a nice hybrid which has been created by some of the video conferencing services, such as Zoom, which provides the opportunity for an additional channel to be created so that an interpreter can also interpret simultaneously. And this could be used in court. For example, it could be used when for a bond reconsideration hearing where a judge has an entire room of, let's say, 10 people who are in a jail room, and the judge makes his or her opening statement. With the simultaneous interpreter feature, you would be able to interpret, and that person would be able to hear it on a separate channel. And then later, when the judge addresses that person, you would be able to switch back and forth between English and your other language and interpret consecutively. So take a look. There are a lot of tutorials out there and lots of information from a lot of the organizations, such as the Atlanta Association of Interpreters and Translators and the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators, who have done webinars. And there are many other there are many other tutorials out there that would get you started on learning about that. Now, we just talked about this, the modes that you would use. And the simultaneous, there's one other really interesting thing that you might hear about for the video remote interpreting, and as a matter of fact, even for OPI. And this is what they called real-time remote. What is basically that you would have two lines. You would either have two phone lines, or you would have one video conferencing line plus an additional phone line. And a person who wants to hear the simultaneous interpretation would be hearing you interpret into that line. So you might have two microphones, for example. It's a little complicated, but it is a really, really interesting way of adapting technology to our needs. In your free time, you might want to explore some of the remote interpreting platforms available. The more familiar you are with them, the better you'll be able to perform your job as an interpreter. Some of them are commercially available consumer apps such as WhatsApp or Skype. And then there are others that are a little bit more complicated to use and perhaps might require some level of membership. These include Zoom, GoToMeeting, WebEx, BoostLingo, the Stratus platform, or any of the other platforms provided by a call center, an agency, or any other kind of group that provides interpreting services. Now, for remote simultaneous interpretation, some of the better known RSI platforms are Kudo, Interprify, VoiceBoxer, Interactio, and if you do the real-time remote interpreting, which we talked about earlier, you might be able to combine Zoom, GoToMeeting, and WebEx for a simultaneous experience. Earlier, we discussed some of the advantages and disadvantages of remote interpreting technologies. Obviously, one of these is the ability to work from home. And for freelance interpreters, this is also very good because it allows interpreters to work with and for multiple clients on a given day. However, OPI interpreters need to make sure that the quality of their sound and their audio is pristine and that they are in an environment where they're not going to be encountering any unexpected sounds. For VRI and RSI interpreters, it is also important that your background project a certain sense of professionalism, and having a solid background or projection screen behind you, including proper lighting, is going to be extremely important for you. Now, as far as the dress code is concerned, you can probably work in your pajamas if you're working over the phone. However, if you're working on VRI or RSI, you'll probably have to dress up a little more. The joke is, of course, that you could be dressed up from the waist up and wearing your pajamas from the waist down, but I'll leave that up to you. Business casual to professional, and it depends on the assignment. Beginning interpreters always want to know, how can I get work and how much will I be paid? We're going to give you a little bit of general guidance, and it's really up to you to contact organizations in your area for specific rates as well as for specific work conditions. But basically, all interpreters are able to work either full-time, contract, or freelance, depending on the availability of employment in their area. And the freelance and the contract interpreters might be hired per hour for a pre-negotiated minimum period of time, let's say, 9 to 12 or 3 hours, 4 hours, or some of them even per minute. That is more common with over the phone interpreting and VRI interpreting rather than in person interpreting. The companies and the organizations that might employ you include agencies, language services, court administrators, private attorneys, nonprofit organizations, and others. Probably the only Because remote simultaneous interpretation is generally used for longer events, such as conferences, meetings, and perhaps long hearings, generally interpreters will be hired for a minimum number of hours, a half day, or a full day. But it is very rare that you might be hired for simultaneous interpretation on a per minute basis. Reviewing our technical requirements, you must have reliable high-speed internet, minimum 10 megabytes downstream, 2 megabytes upstream, and the requirements will also vary by language service providers or by platform. So these are just general guidelines for you. Check to see if your equipment conforms to these guidelines. It's very easy to do so by running a speed test at speedtest.net. Use desktop or laptop. You know what? Hold on. Run a speed test.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I saw that. I was gonna wait for you to finish.
Sorry. We were almost at the. We were almost. I'm sorry. It's past 5 o'clock. We were almost at the. I'm making you work overtime.
No, it's fine. Maria, I'm telling you, these projects, I don't know what time is anymore.
You and
I
me
just
both.
work.
You and me both. Okay. I'm ready. Reviewing our technical requirements, it's very important that you have a reliable high-speed internet connection at all times. The requirements are going to vary by language service provider or by platform used by the court system that is hiring you. Run a speed test on your internet connection at www.speedtest.net or on any other speed test site. Use a desktop, laptop, or tablet device, but make sure that you have proper framing and that it is set in such a way that the picture isn't going to shift. Use light, comfortable, professional quality binaural headset with noise canceling, microphone, and a mute button, and a high resolution webcam. Make sure to adjust your video and use proper lighting. Work in a quiet video room and familiarize yourself with video platforms and applications. And if you would like more information and further practice, please visit some of these resources. In particular, the National Center for State Courts has a video remote interpreting resource website, which is www.ncsc.org/VRI. In addition, there's some remote simultaneous interpreting resources which have been provided by some of the interpreting organizations nationally and internationally. Thank you for joining us today to review remote interpreting technologies. This is a fast changing and exciting area of interpreting, and we hope that you will be able to take advantage of the resources provided here so that you will have one more tool in your toolbox. Thank you very much and have a nice day.